When people think of the Traitor Primarchs, the mental image is usually pretty simple. Frothing demon princes, frolicking through the warp like it's spring break in hell. Lorgar praying to his new best friends, Fulgrim becoming a snake with a drug problem, Angren turning into, well, Angren, but bigger. It's easy to lump them all into the same bucket. They betrayed the Emperor, so they became Chaos worshippers. But that's not the whole story. In fact, some of the Emperor's wayward sons absolutely despised Chaos. They hated demons, rejected the gods, and spat on the very idea of bending the knee. And yet by the end of the Horus Heresy, even some of those Primarchs were wearing the warp like a straitjacket. That's the tragedy of it. Being a traitor didn't always mean being a servant of chaos. It sometimes meant being trapped by the very thing you hated most. Today, we're digging into those Primarchs, the bitter engineers, the nihilists, the double agents, the ones who fought tooth and nail against the warp, even as it swallowed them whole. And then, at the end, we'll talk about the ones who weren't full-on zealots either. Primarchs like Fulgrim and Magnus, who didn't exactly hate chaos, but also didn't dive in headfirst the way Lorgar did. So let's take a look at the Traitor Primarchs who hated chaos, starting with a siege master who mocked the gods even as he became their unwilling champion. Perturabo is perhaps the most tragic paradox among the Primarchs when it comes to chaos. Bitter, cynical, and utterly logical, he despised the notion of gods or demons. To him, they were unreliable and treacherous forces that fools put their faith in. He openly mocked any warrior who treated the ruinous powers as deities, branding them as weaklings clinging to fairy tales. This disdain ran so deep that when people speak of the Primarchs who hated chaos, Perturabo is the name that inevitably rises to the top. And yet Perturabo's fate was not one of triumph over the warp, but of cruel inevitability. He became the ultimate symbol of irony, the general who detested chaos above all else, only to be shackled by it in the end. But unlike the others, Perturabo's fall was not the result of greed, ambition, or blind faith. It was the product of betrayal. Fulgrim, ever the peacock of excess, used Perturabo in a ritual designed to fuel his own ascension to demonhood. The ritual drained Perturabo's essence, leaving him gravely weakened. By the later stages of the heresy, he was a broken shell of himself, his once mighty body sustained only by crude life support modifications grafted into his armor. The bitter irony here is almost poetic. Perturabo, who loathed superstition, became a twisted mirror of what the Emperor would become, trapped in a prison of metal and wires just to cling to survival. And here's where things get murky, almost mythic. Official lore paints him as a demon prince, raised like so many of his brothers. But many fans, myself included, question if that was ever truly the case. Perturabo denied Nurgle's offer of salvation when death loomed over him, spitting in the face of a god when any other might have grasped at survival. He never once bowed to chaos willingly, and his supposed ascension has the sour aftertaste of inevitability rather than choice. Some argue that he may have found another way, manipulating the warp with his unmatched intellect, bending the rules to keep his body alive without ever truly surrendering his soul. That interpretation feels far more fitting for Perturabo, a man too clever, too pragmatic, and too stubborn to ever kneel fully to the powers he hated. To me, this is why Perturabo remains one of the most fascinating figures of the heresy. Unlike Horus or Fulgrim, his story isn't about pride or temptation. It's about a man dragged down by betrayal and circumstance, forced into a role he never wanted. He didn't embrace chaos, he endured it resisted it, and may have even outwitted it. Whether or not he truly became a demon prince almost doesn't matter. What matters is that Perturabo, the cold engineer of war, stands as the embodiment of defiance, a reminder that sometimes, even when you lose, refusing to kneel can still be a kind of victory. If Perturabo is the bitter logician of the Traitor Primarchs, then Konrad Curze is their doomsayer, the prophet of despair who spat in the face of every god, including those of chaos. Curze didn't want glory or demonhood or eternal power. He wanted fear. Fear was his only god, and he wielded it with surgical brutality. The Night Lords inherited that same disdain for warp worshippers. They are marauders and murderers, not cultists. They don't pray to demons, they skin people and nail the remains to the walls as warnings. Curze made sure his sons despised chaos just as much as they despised everything else. The problem with Curze, though, is that he never really believed he had a choice. His visions, those cursed glimpses of the future, poisoned his mind from the very beginning. When he first met his brothers, he didn't see warriors or allies. He saw symbols of inevitable doom, Fulgrim slithering like a snake, Ferrus Manus walking headless, the Emperor blazing like a god of flame. These weren't possibilities in his eyes. They were immutable truths. Where others might have seen the warp's prophecies as warnings, Curze saw them as fate carved in stone. This warped his entire perspective on reality, giving him a deterministic view of existence where his every cruelty was already fated. He wasn't making choices, he was playing out a script he could never escape. Combine this fatalism with his sadism and mental instability, and you get a perfect recipe for tragedy. He didn't join Horus because he believed in him, or because he thought chaos had the answers. He joined because in his eyes, it was inevitable. A universe without free will is a universe without meaning. And Curze leaned into that despair, turning himself into the monster his visions demanded he become. Bombing his homeworld into ashes only confirmed his belief that fate was unchangeable, that cruelty was all the galaxy would ever know. Curze's ending is perhaps the most fitting rejection of chaos imaginable. He chose death over it. He knew exactly when and how he would die, and instead of fighting against it or begging the gods for power, he embraced it. When the assassin's blade came for him, he welcomed it as freedom. No demonhood, no throne of skulls or garden of rot, no eternal servitude to the warp, just oblivion. Konrad Curze's death wasn't just an end. It was a final, defiant refusal. For all his madness, for all his atrocities, his last act was a rejection of being turned into yet another puppet of chaos. In a galaxy full of liars and zealots, Curze died with a kind of brutal honesty. No discussion of Primarchs, who rejected chaos, is complete without the most confusing pair in the galaxy, Alpharius and Omegon, the twin heads of the Alpha Legion Hydra. Outwardly, they seem to embrace the heresy like the rest of their brothers. They wore the traitor's colors, struck at imperial worlds, and played their role in Horus's grand rebellion. But peel back even a single layer of their endless schemes, and you'll find something stranger. Unlike Lorgar's devotion or Angron's rage, the Alpha Legion never truly worshipped the gods of the warp. To them, chaos was just another mask, a camouflage pattern they draped themselves in to get closer to their enemies. The irony here is that Alpharius and Omegon might have been the most anti-chaos Primarchs of them all. Their story ties into the Cabal, a shadowy Xenos cabal of seers who claimed to know the fate of the galaxy. According to their visions, if the Emperor won the heresy, humanity would endure. But chaos would infest the species so deeply that it would spread like a cancer across the galaxy, eternal and unstoppable. But if Horus won, humanity would burn itself out in self-destruction, leaving chaos starved of hosts and eventually extinguished. Two terrible futures, but one promised an end to the warp gods. Alpharius, ever the pragmatist, chose the latter. He sided with Horus not because he wanted the War Master's victory, but because he believed it was the only path to destroying chaos once and for all. Omegon, on the other hand, seems to have taken a different road. He played along with the rebellion, but left breadcrumbs of sabotage in his wake. There are strong implications that he secretly aided the Loyalists, undermining Horus's war effort whenever he could, a saboteur hiding in plain sight. If Alpharius was willing to doom humanity to save the galaxy from chaos, Omegon was trying to thread the needle, weaken Horus, frustrate the gods, and maybe, just maybe, find a path where both humanity and freedom from chaos could survive. Two heads, two philosophies, united by one truth. Neither of them ever wanted to bow to the warp. In a cruel twist, the Alpha Legion's relentless secrecy makes it impossible to know for sure how far their anti-chaos agenda really went. Were they playing 10-dimensional chess to save the galaxy, or were they just deluded by the Cabal's lies? Did Alpharius actually die at Guilliman's hand, or was that another mask? Was Omegon the true Primarch all along? What we can say is this: of all the traitor brothers, Alpharius and Omegon were the only ones who turned their rebellion into an anti-chaos mission, even if it meant tearing humanity apart in the process. They weren't pawns of the gods. They were the only Primarchs who tried to flip the board. If there's one Primarch who defined himself by hatred of the warp, it was Mortarion. Raised on Barbarous, a world smothered in toxic fog and ruled by warp-tainted warlords, he learned early that psychers and witches were the true enemy of humanity. Everything about his upbringing turned him against demons and their gifts. He despised sorcery, loathed mutation, and prided himself on endurance, the ability to suffer without breaking. Mortarion's entire identity rested on rejecting the warp and enduring its horrors without bowing to it. And yet, that's exactly what happened. During the heresy, Nurgle's corruption didn't come to him as a temptation, but as a prison. A wasting plague broke him down until the only way to survive was to give in. His fall wasn't triumphant or even defiant. It was pitiful. He begged for relief, and the plague god answered. One of the most vocal haters of the warp became one of its greatest champions, a demon prince of rot and ruin. The irony here is brutal. The Primarch who hated psychers became little more than a walking plague spell, a being animated by the very sorcery he once despised. And honestly, it's hard not to see him as a coward. Mortarion was supposed to be the one who endured. He was the child who could breathe the poison mists of Barbarous when no one else could. He was the symbol of grit, of survival in the face of suffering. And yet when the true test came, he folded faster than anyone. Compared to Perturabo, a Primarch who spat in the face of gods even as he was dying on life support, Mortarion looks weak. Perturabo endured out of spite. Mortarion crumbled out of fear. For a man who built his entire identity on hating chaos, his submission to it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal of his very self. Mortarion embodies the cruelest irony of the heresy. Those who screamed loudest about resisting the warp often fell the hardest to it. Not because they loved chaos, but because when the pressure came, they couldn't live up to their own ideals. Mortarion didn't just lose the war for his soul, he forfeited it, and in doing so, became everything he once swore to destroy. If there's one Primarch who never cared about chaos, it was Angron. He didn't worship demons, he didn't pray to the gods, and he never once made some grand bargain with the Warp. What Angron did care about was his hatred for the Imperium, for slavery, and above all, for the Emperor, who stole his one chance at a warrior's death. Angron's entire life was defined by chains, the nails hammered into his skull that drove him into blood rage, and the chains of fate that dragged him into the heresy against his will. Chaos wasn't his cause. It was just where his fury happened to point. To understand Angron's hatred of the Emperor, you have to go back to New Syria. Angron had finally risen up with his fellow gladiators, ready to die free on the battlefield. That was the moment of liberation he had been fighting for his entire life. But the Emperor didn't let it happen. Instead, he teleported Angron away from his people, leaving his comrades to be slaughtered while he was dragged into the Great Crusade. In Angron's eyes, the Emperor was no better than his slavers. He had stolen his rebellion, stolen his death, and left him alive in chains once more. Chains of duty, chains of loyalty, chains to a father he despised. During the heresy, when Angron's body was burning out under the butcher's nails, Lorgar intervened with a plan, one of the most grotesque manipulations in Imperial history. Lorgar, ever the devout servant of chaos, arranged for Angron's ascension. And let's be clear, this was not a reward, nor a choice. Angron didn't kneel. He didn't beg the blood god for power. He was torn apart, reforged, and shackled to eternity against his will. Lorgar turned him into a demon prince, a being of undying rage, unable even to claim the death he craved. It was the ultimate cruelty, a mockery of Angron's deepest desire. That's what makes Angron such a unique case study. He didn't fall to chaos in the way Fulgrim, Lorgar, or even Magnus did. He didn't embrace it. He didn't rationalize it. He didn't want it. He became a creature of the Warp purely by accident, or rather, by betrayal. His ascension was just another form of slavery, one he could never break. Angron wasn't a champion of Khorne because he believed in the god of blood. He was simply too angry, too broken, and too tragic to ever escape the path laid out for him. Angron's demonhood was a curse forced upon him, and the fact that Lorgar is behind it is one of the many reasons he deserves every ounce of contempt history heaps on him. No discussion of Traitor Primarchs and chaos would be complete without Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself. In the beginning, Horus was the Emperor's favored son, the Golden General who conquered half the galaxy in his name. The Warp wasn't something he revered. In fact, he barely knew anything about it, something that absolutely played a part in his fall. Horus's rebellion didn't start with demon whispers or profane promises. It began with pride. He wanted to be more than the Emperor's lieutenant. He wanted to be the Emperor, the top dog of humanity, master of the stars. His story is less about devotion and more about vanity, the Lucifer archetype in space, rebelling against God because he couldn't stand being second. The turning point, though, is that infamous moment on Davin, where Horus was struck down by the Athame blade and brought to the brink of death. The ritual that saved him wasn't medicine. It was a profane bargain. Horus's soul was dragged through the warp, broken and reshaped in ways even he didn't fully grasp. Some argue that he was never truly himself after that the War Master who strode out of the ritual was already a corrupted echo of the man who went in. Others suggest that he retained enough control to use the god's power for his own ends. But either way, the seed was planted. Pieces of his soul were carved away in exchange for strength. From that point on, every victory, every surge of power came with another slice of his essence handed over to the warp. By the end of the heresy, Horus wasn't the rebel general anymore. He was a puppet. His pride, once his defining strength, became the lever the Chaos gods used to control him. The War Master, who had once spat at the gods, now wore their blessings like chains. In his final duel with the Emperor, he wasn't just Horus anymore. He was the gods' chosen champion, their mask of war, their perfect vessel. That battle wasn't father against son, so much as humanity's last hope against chaos incarnate. And that's what makes Horus so fascinating in this discussion. He began as leader, driven by ambition and vanity rather than worship. But step by step, bargain by bargain, his hatred and pride only deepened his enslavement. He didn't fall to chaos because he believed in it. He fell because he thought he could control it. Horus is the ultimate case study of how rejecting chaos doesn't save you if your arrogance makes you think you can outplay gods. Not every traitor Primarch went into chaos with open arms. Some fought it, some resisted, and some only fell because they were cornered. They were broken into it, seduced into it, or manipulated into making choices they couldn't take back. Fulgrim and Magnus are the clearest examples. Fulgrim would not have fallen without that cursed sword. At first, he resisted its whispers. And make no mistake, Fulgrim wasn't a hollow narcissist, at least not at the start. For all his vanity, there was a genuine spark in him. He believed humanity could be raised higher, refined, perfected. He wanted the Emperor's children to embody not just military power, but virtue and greatness, a guiding light for mankind. There was even an echo of the Emperor's love for humanity in Fulgrim, the kind of ideal you'd expect from someone like Sanguinius, not the man who would become a demon prince of Slaanesh. But Fulgrim's fall came through tragedy. The demon blade gnawed at him, whispering, twisting, slowly eroding his will. And then came Ferrus Manus. In his corrupted haze, Fulgrim killed his most beloved brother, and when the reality of it hit him, it shattered his spirit. Fulgrim didn't kneel to chaos because he wanted its gifts. He gave up. Broken by grief, disgusted with himself, he let the demon take the wheel. His demonhood wasn't ambition, it was despair. Magnus, meanwhile, represents the other path, the one who thought he could master the warp. Magnus wasn't blind to chaos. He hated corruption, mutation, and the fickleness of demons. But unlike Mortarion, who fled from it, or Perturabo, who mocked it, Magnus thought he could control it. To him, the warp was knowledge, a power that could be bent to humanity's will if only guided properly. He genuinely believed he could save the Imperium with sorcery, and his warnings about Horus prove he wasn't entirely wrong. But that arrogance blinded him to the dangers. The tragedy of Magnus is that his final fall wasn't even really his fault. Horus manipulated events to unleash the Space Wolves on Prospero, turning a disciplinary censure into a massacre. Magnus, shattered and humiliated, watched his legion burn. In desperation, in pieces, he turned to the one force left that could save his sons, Tzeentch. And of course, the irony is vicious. Magnus joined chaos to save his legion, and in the end, it destroyed them anyway. Unlike Fulgrim, who gave in to grief, Magnus was forced into chaos by circumstance, and the only real choice he made was to cling to his sons, even if it damned him forever. Chaos in Warhammer 40k isn't a one-size-fits-all corruption story. Some Primarchs leapt into its embrace with zeal, Others were dragged kicking and screaming, and a few slipped inch by inch until they no longer recognized the face in the mirror. That's what makes their tragedies so compelling. These aren't cartoon villains, but deeply flawed figures, caught between pride, pain, and manipulation. In the end, chaos doesn't need willing worshippers. It just needs cracks in the armor. And that's really the lesson here. Chaos doesn't conquer by force alone. Sometimes it's rage that can't cool, pride that can't bend, grief that won't heal, or desperation that leaves no other choice. Each Primarch's fall tells us something about the different faces of corruption and how easy it is to mistake control for freedom until it's far too late. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Primarch's unwilling damnation, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the madness of 40k lore. Trust me, you're going to want to see where we go next.